Almighty God, source of all that is, giver of every good gift, you create all people in your image and call us to love one another as you love us. We confess that we have failed to honor you in the great diversity of the human family. We have desired to live in freedom while building walls between ourselves and others. We have longed to be known and accepted for who we are, while making judgments of others based on the color of skin or the shape of features or the varieties of human experience. We've tried to love our neighbors individually while yet benefiting from systems that hold those same neighbors in oppression. Forgive us, Holy God. Give us eyes to see you as you are revealed in all people. Strengthen us for the work of reconciliation, rooted in love. Restore us in your image to be beloved community, united in our diversity, even as you are one with Christ in the Spirit, holy and undivided Trinity, now and forever. Amen. So we're excited today. Tim was just saying our guest today is our most famous one yet. So I'm excited to announce that Tony Caldwell is with us this morning. And I have lots to share about Tony and what he's doing, but on a personal note, I have known Tony and his amazing family for over 10 years. Tony, I tried to think back to when y'all were at that Montessori school when I first started there, and Silas, your son, was just a little tiny tot when y'all were there, and I think probably he's 13 now. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about 11 years ago.
It's been a long time, and it's been really wonderful to watch you and all the different things you've been involved in, and it's been wonderful to keep bumping back into you over these last few years. But Tony is a psychotherapist in Nashville in private practice. He also writes and speaks for Red Letter Christians. He is an activist and educator addressing systemic racism and other social ills through the lens of our faith. And currently, he is founding the Representation Education Project, and its aim is to support future mental health practitioners of color through named scholarships. One thing he didn't list, but he also preaches. I've heard him preach. And he also has an amazing podcast called Voices of Wisdom. So y'all, if you are in the car a lot or like to listen to podcasts at home, check that out. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tony, but thanks for being with us this morning.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and it's good to be with you all. I want to start by acknowledging the passing of Congressman John Lewis. There was a heaviness that I felt, and my wife and I and a few friends were talking about this heaviness we just felt a couple of days prior, kind of leading up to that. And you almost have to wonder if there's a connection to that much goodness leaving our realm, But it made me think about, we had just watched the documentary on his life, 3 or 4 nights before. And everything came back to his faith, so a lot of what he modeled and a lot of the reasons people looked up to him and were drawn to him was that he was not really professing his faith, he was walking in his faith. And, there's a way in which everything came back to embodiment for him more than just a stance or, he wasn't the greatest orator or writer really, but his simple message was not unlike that of Jesus or Thich Nhat Hanh or a lot of other people who embodied who they were and didn't just act as a mouthpiece for a certain ideology. We could say the same of Dr. King. Everything that we respect and admire about him came back to his faith. The nonviolence and the lack of reactivity that he modeled went back to his faith. And he actually, went and spent time with Gandhi's family to see what are the roots of this nonviolent practice that you embodied. And what he found out was that Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount every day for over 27 years. So his nonviolence was rooted in our faith. even though he wasn't a professing or practicing Christian per se. I think it really presses us to try to redefine what exactly it means to be a Christian. Is it a set of beliefs, or is it a set of practices? Is it embodiment? Is it a way of being in the world? Is it some combination of all of the above? But embodiment's really been on my mind. And I think, first of all, we have to have spiritual eyes that can cut through illusion, because everything's politicized, even down to the bodies of black men. As soon as those are put on the news, and a lot of people call it murder porn for a reason, there's a certain sense of sensationalism and a sense of entertainment around that's really, I think, more lethal and more, frankly, evil than we're willing to really see or admit, or really even we're able to acknowledge. It's just sort of in the collective, and we're soaking it up every day. But we need spiritual eyes to cut through the illusion that try to politicize that body, that try to make it a red and blue argument instead of just a Christian argument for those of us who are followers of Christ, to get out of that same old trap of trying to process human life through a red and blue filter. It's just inadequate. It doesn't hold up. And there's so many battles that do have to be fought on that level, unfortunately. But I think the politicization of black bodies is something that's just not working right now for anyone. It's harmful to the black community, and I think it's, Dr. King talked about how we're in a web of mutuality, and so it's also affecting those of us who are white in all the wrong ways, in ways that are helping us perpetuate our place in problematic systems and problematic ways of addressing systems. So I think we need eyes that see and ears that hear, primarily, before it becomes Fox versus CNN or something like that, to primarily hear the cries of the blood of Abel, and that's the cries of Mike Brown's blood. That's the cries of George Floyd's blood. That's the cries of a lot of people's blood. That's Breonna Taylor's blood crying out from the ground. And so when we live in a society here in the South, especially, where we have strategically placed symbols of oppression that we argue over as if it's a political issue only, or a matter of heritage or hate or something like that only, and we don't have spiritual eyes to see that these monuments are literally the opposite of the cross. The cross unites. These symbols, Confederate symbols in particular, are symbols of division. They divide. They don't heal. They don't bring us onto a path of enlargement. It's a path of diminishment and destruction. And so I grew up in the shadow of these monuments. Right outside of my bedroom window was a Confederate monument. I saw it every time I looked out of my bedroom window as a kid. And that's really informed my life in that, there's something scary and there's some dark energy around that. We tend to, again, fluff it up and make it into almost this, like we're talking about a fairy tale of what it is and what it isn't. But the reality is, these things were put in place at particular times for particular reasons, mostly during the Jim Crow era, to let people know who's still boss and who's still running things. And so they're representations of a caste system as well. I can remember in high school, people really reading about caste systems in India and saying, oh, that's horrible, and not realizing our classroom was a caste system as well. Our town square had a monument to the Southern caste system, And so that white supremacy, we tend to think of white supremacy or talk about white supremacy as if it's just the 1% of people who show up on a town square with Confederate flags, but the other 99% of white supremacy is the rest of us who think that we're not operating within and participants in white supremacy. And so it's kind of hard to actively participate in something but say we're not doing it. It's kind of hard to get in the water and swim around and say, yeah, I'm not really a swimmer. We're either actively participating in something or we're not. And denial and defense mechanisms come up around that for a lot of us. But it doesn't change the fact that those defenses and denial and the anger and even things like white guilt, they're all impediments to corrective action and repentance wherever we might find ourselves in the whole social matrix, and just really to take personal responsibility for the welfare of our siblings, and whether that be the person next door, whether that be the person in poverty, whether that's our brothers and sisters who are, of a racial minority or a sexual minority. I think, anywhere there's a line drawn and there's someone who's oppressed or marginalized, Jesus is always on the side they're on. And once American Christianity is just colluded with empire, and it started with, I think it's telling that the thing we're wrestling with now points us right back to the original wound where white Christianity in America found a way to get okay with slavery. And there's been influence that's not of God operating within our congregations ever since that moment. That's the moment of infection, So as Otis Moss III said, we're not just fighting COVID-19, we're also fighting Confederate 1619. There's still the sense of, slaveholder religion. And by that, I mean a religion that has found a way to get okay with slavery and then produced a few generations afterward, and we still have all these false narratives around what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, and all these excuses. Well, it was about states' rights. Yes, states' rights to own people. So all these ways of denial. And M. Scott Peck, who's a Christian psychiatrist who wrote a lot of books. His most famous one was The Road Less Traveled. He said he wrote a book called People of the Lie, and he said, all we really have to do as people who are trying to follow Christ, all we have to do to participate in evil is to know a difficult truth and fail to name it. That's all we have to do. And then we're actively participating in evil at that point. We can overlook someone being harmed and just find a way to psychologically distance from that and get okay with it, or to spiritualize it in some way. And so I think that's a lot of what we do when we look at systemic problems. We say, well, there's a few bad apples on the police force. Well, no, the infection that's in society as a whole produces individuals who become police officers. They also become judges and serve in every other role. And all you need for a sick system is one sick person within that system, and the system is sick. And that is contagious. It spreads, through peer pressure or fear of not belonging if you speak up, fear of being ousted, a lot of different pressures where we don't speak up. And that's where the white church has failed us. A black pastor a while back I heard say, the black church is the black church because the white church failed to be the church. And I think that's still happening, when there's still business owners, pastors, leaders, people who are gatekeepers, who stay silent and complicit. That's more dangerous than being a flat out bigot, because at least you can name that, right? But it's, we live in a Christian culture here in the South where it's more dangerous to be gay than it is to be a racist. And that's a spiritual problem. It's a moral problem. It's a relational problem that has become a political problem through things like House Bill 1523, where we say it's religious liberty, but really it's religious domination and oppression and subjugation. It's coming from the same energy that the Jim Crow laws and the Confederate statutes arose from. So there's still a spiritual darkness that has to be addressed on the spiritual level. And frankly, the majority of our white clergy are failing still to address this. And, there's also the sense of being beheld to the highest donors. A lot of pastors don't want to interrupt tithing from someone they're going to upset by naming what needs to be named. So being prophetic messes with your profits. So you're stuck between, do I want to embody the role of prophet, or do I want financial profit? And there's a real sense of serving two masters there. And I see that over and over and over. I know that's very much, or I'm assuming that's very much less of a temptation or something that happens within the Episcopal Church. But I do know I come from the evangelical world and from a Methodish world. And a lot of people trying to hold the middle are really just being complicit, unfortunately. And there's also the idol of family. There's the way in which we want to believe, we have the psychological need as children to believe that our parents and our family are good. That's why children who are abused will take that on and carry the shame, because it's easier to feel like I'm bad than to think that the people who are managing your life and in whose mercy you kind of live are bad. And so a lot of us grow up and we see a lot that's bad, but we fail to name it because there's the need for our family to be good, you know. And if you've ever dealt with maybe addiction in a family, a lot of times the one who names what's going on is scapegoated and seen as being disloyal, but really they're the ones who care the most. It's their health they're speaking from, you know. And when we have conversations around race, the same thing happens. You know, if you speak out, then you get scapegoated pretty quickly. And it takes a whole lot of maturity and a whole lot of grit to admit what's going on in us, what's going on in our families, what's going on in our communities without putting up defenses, you know, and just walk in it and own it and feel it. That's why I don't believe white guilt really exists for a Christian anyway. White guilt is what you feel when you're not busy taking corrective action. So at the end of the day, white guilt is just a failure to repent and to take corrective action. So it's not helpful. And I can't help but think of Jesus, who said, you know, who they thought he was crazy, you know, and his family came to kind of get him and talk some sense into him. And he said, well, who's really my brother, sister, and mother? It's the people who do the will of God, right? And I don't think, you know, it's also the Jesus who said, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God. I don't think Confederate statues belong to God. I think they belong to Caesar. So liberal agendas or political whatever, like all these things that people say, hey, they're erasing our culture. Well, God, that's because you didn't beat them to it by doing what your faith required, you know, and that's hard. That's difficult. A lot of people want to be coddled by their faith or, you know, sort of held by their faith. And that's all great. We all need it. I need it too. But we also need to be challenged and pushed to grow in our faith. And, you know, honestly, a lot of the kindergarten or Sunday school level faith 2.0 as an adult is the problem. You know, we've been coddled in an immature faith that doesn't tell us that to pick up your cross and follow Jesus and to follow him to where? Jerusalem, the place of crucifixion and suffering, means you're going to suffer. And that part of following Jesus means you choose to suffer on purpose for the benefit of the other. So I do think of all of this as spiritual warfare. And I mean, I think we need also the capacity to think symbolically as well, because I mean, think about Jesus taking his last breath and feeling forsaken and calling out to his Father. And then George Floyd taking his last breath and feeling forsaken and calling out to his mother, you know, and you know, for anybody who's listening that thinks I'm trying to equate the two individuals, you know, that's one of those kind of defenses that gets in the way sometimes. What I'm pointing out is this feeling of being forsaken and this feeling of needing the maternal or the paternal to intervene points to the fact that we say we're the church and we're the hands and feet. That means ultimately George Floyd was calling out to us when he called out to his mom. You know, he was calling out to humanity. And so I think Christians, we have to read scripture without a political filter. You know, as soon as we run the murder of a black man through a news channel, we're already skewed. We need to just sit with that, meditate on it, feel it, and let it orient us or reorient us to reality where we have eyes to see and ears to hear that aren't so influenced by people with agendas who want to benefit from our psychological and emotional, you know, subjugation to them. And that's what a lot of the major news, or all of the major news networks are doing, some way worse than others, but we feel its influence. And a lot of people who are claiming to follow Jesus are watching, you know, 7 hours of news media a day and reading the Bible once a month, you know, and that's part of the problem. Then when we do that, we're running the Bible through a political filter instead of running our politics through a biblical filter. And that's part of where we've gone wrong, that collusion between empire and faith. And I think a big thing that happens there when we do that is we fail to read Scripture from the bottom up. Scripture was written to, by, and for oppressed people. And when we read Scripture from the top down, trickle down gospel, if you will, we have it all wrong. That's why Christianity seems to flourish in places where there are marginalized people, and it tends to become destructive wherever it colludes with empire and becomes kind of bloated and self-satisfied and self-serving, and starts wanting to do things like put the Ten Commandments in the courthouse where you hand down the death penalty. That's Christianity has merged with politics at that point to the point that it's not even really, it has too many additives and preservatives at that point, and we can't see clearly. So I think looking to the model of Jesus, and again, developing the capacity to think symbolically so that we can merge with these larger narratives. None of these stories are new. They're all in the Bible. We say, biblical times, and then these times. Well, these are biblical times. When did biblical times stop? Every time it is biblical time. And we are in a time of apocalypse. The Hollywood or evangelical version of that word means, God's going to kill the bad people and take the good people to another place. And really, apocalypse literally means an unveiling. It's like turning over the rock and seeing what's under it, what's squirming around. And we're living in a time of apocalypse right now, and it's a call to radical inner work, radical self-care, radical care of the other. When we think of the world as a place that's just going to kind of incinerate as we leave it and go to some better place, we're not living in a biblical way, that talks about a new heaven and a new earth, the transformation of us and the restoration of an original wholeness. And so that original wholeness includes things like getting back to who we were before we were told who we are. Well, in this family, you believe this. Well, in this neighborhood, you believe that. Well, you hang out with these people. All these claims on our identity, and we lose our primary identity, which is child of God, just like everyone else. Adam, made from the Adamah, the literally earthling that we see in Genesis, who we call Adam, made from the dirt. He's soil meets soul, just like every other human. Created by the divine, and it's a glorious thing. But we tend to start, again, building those caste systems in our mind, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, black and white, illegal and legal. And we're not in the kingdom anymore. The kingdom is a parallel place happening right now. We're just either participating in that or we're not. We're either, most of us, most of the time, have a foot in each dimension, if you will. But the king, Jesus talked about the kingdom as being in here, in our midst. And, he is the kingdom. We are, the kingdom's in us. I'm in the Father, the Father's in me, you're in me. This whole connectivity. But basically, the kingdom is you, me, and the space between us. And that's a lifestyle. That's a way of being. That's an orientation to reality that most of us aren't living in. And it takes a whole lot of contemplation and a whole lot of discipline and practice to try to live in that way. I fail at it every day, but I think that's what we're supposed to be aiming for. Otherwise, we're just living in the material world and acting as if we're trying to be spiritual beings, when really we were born spiritual beings. We just have to get back to that. And a lot of us are afraid to go there. A lot of our congregations they tell us not to go there. Don't trust your own deepest experience. Trust the familiar narrative. Trust the bylaws of this particular congregation or denomination, and we get cut off from an authentic spirituality. I knew Jesus when I was 6, but the church started telling me who Jesus was through their eyes, and it was really different. And so I thought, well, they're older. There's more of them. They must know the truth. And it took me to my 30s to come back around and reclaim the faith of a child, the exact thing Jesus tells us to get back to, right? But the whole notion of sort of a CYA Christianity, if you will, where we need to protect ourselves from the being out there who loves us but will also kill us if we make the wrong move or believe the wrong thing, is so damaging. It's so objectifying. It's so shaming. And we get disconnected from an authentic unfolding. And I think a lot of white young people and middle-aged people are walking away from the church. So when people say the church is dying, they aren't talking about the church in Asia or Africa or South America, or even the black church. They're talking about the white church in America. And I think a lot of white people are following a brown Jesus out of white churches. I think that's what's happening. It's an exodus of sorts. I think when the church becomes toxic enough, Jesus will lead us out of the church, unfortunately, out of the doors anyway, to just go be the church. And that's happening. There's a mass exodus from especially evangelical circles right now. And so toxic theology, it justified slavery. It now persecutes LGBTQ people. It's still there. And then there's this paranoia in it, this fear of karma that I hear a lot of my white peers talk about. I think a lot of white Christians are more afraid of karma than hell. It's like, well, if we become the minority and we're not running things, what's going to happen to us? And there's a fear it will look exactly like or very similar to what minorities face right now. And so I think Jesus tells us how to handle that. Levitical law tells us how to handle that. The prophets tell us how to handle that. It's not about us. What if we had a Jubilee year in 2021 and forgave all debts? There's a lot of ways that, we have to heal. And I know, Mary Howard, we were in the Kellogg Foundation group together, and the very first night, this went on for, I think, eight weeks. And the very first night, the white affinity group that we were a part of, the main thing that was identified and was a major wound throughout those 8 weeks was the fact that everyone across, I think our ages were like from teenagers to maybe in their 70s. And everyone felt like their community, their family, and their clergy and their community of faith had failed them in naming and addressing racism and creating a culture and atmosphere that just felt like, don't bring it up, don't say anything. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. I think I may be getting to the point where I need to wrap up and move into questions. So I just want to point out Mark 12, 13 through 17, and I'll read it. So later, the leaders sent some Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap Jesus into saying something for which he could be arrested. Teacher, they said, we know you're honest and you're impartial and you don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully. And that's always a trap that you feel when someone asks you a question that's not really a question. That happens a lot in these conversations. Now tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not pay them or should we? He saw through their hypocrisy and he said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you. When they handed it to him, he said, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. His reply completely amazed them. Well, we have 7 variations in our paper currency, so 7 men own those. 4 of them were slave owners. So 4 out of the 7 images on our currency were slave owners. So this is still not just kind of in the culture, is at the center of our transactions. There's still the reverence for people who didn't heal in their lifetime. And we shouldn't lift that up. We should mourn that. We should grieve that and find a way to heal by not lifting up people who I'm not trying to demonize them, but to say they didn't make it to the point of becoming part of the solution in their lifetime. And we have a society that's not just built upon that, but lifts that up. And that's part of why in a lot of people's minds, the standard image bearer of God is a white, straight, Southern Christian male. And that's just not serving us very well. We can't have true equality if our image of God looks like that. I think if we realize that we actually have a marginalized Jesus that we follow, that really ought to tell us something, that when God could show up in human history in a particular way, that's the packaging he chose. I think that to sit with that and wrestle with that and to decenter ourselves from the story, the what about me, what about mine, what about my neighborhood, what about my well-being, what about my denomination, what about me, the gospel constantly pushes us to decentralize ourselves. So, in closing with that, I would just say, we live geographically in what's the slavery belt, the Jim Crow belt, the lynching belt, the mass incarceration of black men belt, the execution belt. It's the Confederate belt. And that organization of society is antithetical to the gospel, and it never we'll never be able to heal underneath those symbols of domination and separation. True unity is something most of us really don't want, if we're honest. True equality is something we really don't want, if we're honest. It scares us. And if we ever wonder what privilege is, it's the thing we're afraid we'll lose if we become the minority. It's as simple as that. That fear in your gut, that whatever it is attached to that you're afraid you'll lose, that's how you can identify kind of where your relative privilege is. Again, crime and poverty have become synonymous with race. But how did that happen? Let's reverse that. I wonder if the people who really benefited from snuggling up to Pharaoh ever looked at the Hebrew people and said, what about Hebrew on Hebrew crime? Well, guess what? When, the word ghettos is actually a Jewish word, and it means literally you squeeze a whole lot of people into a small space and give them limited resources and watch what unfolds. All the social ills that we're dealing with. And that's why if you look at crime maps, it's inner city black neighborhoods and reservations, Native American reservations. Why is that? A white supremacist could say, well, there's proof of inferiority, or that's making my point for me. No, that's what happens when you completely demolish the inner and outer worlds of a whole collective of people. Untold suffering that obviously hasn't healed through the generations. And so I think living in a biblical way, living in a way that follows Jesus, naturally leads to reparations. It naturally leads to living in a way that is intended to heal that. It's not even about willpower. It's not even about government involvement. It's about living in a way that's informed by the gospel, and you naturally go where the healing is needed. It's a very natural unfolding. That collective trauma among marginalized people is directly related to the collective sin of the white people who committed those crimes, right? And so we can trace collective sin back to Adam. That's kind of, Christianity 101, but we also need to link our collective sin back to Nathan Bedford Forrest and back to Robert E. Lee and back to my grandfather and back to a lot of people who fail to see that the collective sin of one group has created a collective trauma in another group, and that has not healed. And the loving, Christ-following thing to do is to reverse that, live in a way that helps to make that not true or no longer true, instead of just saying get over it, because getting over something and healing from something, in particular healing from being completely devastated by the world and man's image, is not something you just kind of snap your fingers and pull on your bootstraps and get over. So I could go on forever. I'm obviously passionate about this, but I think I'll stop there and take any questions you might have.
Do we have any?
These masks. All right, we do have a couple comments,
Okay.
and then actually a really practical, good question from Jaylene.
Okay.
What are some ideas to help us read assuming scripture without the political filter when it's so prevalent? So
Right.
What are some practical ways that we can kind of filter out the politics, like as you were saying, when we read and digest scripture?
Right. I think it's really, I want to say it's easy, but maybe it may be a growing edge for some people that don't naturally do this. But to be able to think symbolically, and that way, like, put the narrative in your time and place. So if Jesus told me to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, then what would that look like for me in my time and place? So I think looking at the red letters in every question Jesus asked, because he asked a lot of questions, what is he asking me in my time and place? I think that's a great way to do it. I think also, like, one example would be, so you have these guys that lower a man that needs healing down through the roof to Jesus, right? And a healing happens. What would it be like to be as passionate and have as much fervor and as much drive as the people who literally pulled a man up onto a roof and dropped him down through it? What would it look like to be that passionate about someone else's healing, not just our own? And that might be someone in a marginalized neighborhood. I don't know what that looks like for you in particular. It's really easy for a lot of us, especially who are white, to feel really uncomfortable and self-conscious and don't know what to do, don't know what to say. So I think having those conversations is a great place to start. How can I unfold into just being a human in a very natural way that's not so, that doesn't feel like, I don't know, it makes me think of Adam and Eve in the garden. There's all this shame and like, oh, I'm seen and that's a bad thing and I don't know what to do, and all this self-consciousness. How can we move past that feeling and stop making it about us and relax into just operating human to human, even though the human we're interacting with may be packaged in a way, skin color, gender, whatever, that makes us uncomfortable. So I think that we need to start with our own inner work for sure. But again, I think reading, what are these larger things? What does it look like? Here's another example of thinking symbolically. Where do I have a Pharaoh's heart? Where do I keep on and on and on when something in me knows I shouldn't? And maybe even making the connection, before Pharaoh had a hard heart, he had a hard head. He wouldn't listen. And that's how his heart got hardened to the point of his own destruction, right? So where do I do that? Where do I, inner exploration, inner work, inner process. And again, placing ourselves in the narrative, because every narrative in the Bible is still unfolding in some way. We're still humans having the human experience. And there's the unlimited amount of instruction there if we're able to read in a way that's not so influenced by, well, I better think or interpret this way, or my small group's going to be upset with me, and a lot of us are in containers like that are just inadequate for us. Our small groups or our congregations or whatever, that aren't adequate for us. And the best of us know that we face the temptation, we face the dilemma of being inauthentic and sort of shrinking and dying, or kind of blooming into who we are and not belonging anymore. So I think bravery is a big part of, and trust, the faith that will, maybe God's going to unfold me and work that out in a way that just might be painful and beautiful. So I think also faith and trust there.
And please, if you're listening on the live stream, put your questions in the comments and we'll get them to Tony in real time. I found it interesting theologically to think of, I don't know if these were your exact words, but to think of the kingdom of God, not necessarily as a supernatural place where we go to after death, but in the here and now. But in particular, you used something similar to the sort of the sci-fi idea of like a parallel universe or a dimension that is existing alongside this current kingdom of the world that we live in, and that we can in fact kind of pass through back and forth. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the kingdom theologically, specifically for today, right? And more scientific understanding of the world.
Yeah. So Marcus Borg talked about God's dream for the world, or God's original plan for the world. This way of rhythm and harmony and wholeness. And it's kind of what you see in Genesis as well. So I think part of what I'm talking about there is getting back in tune with our original wholeness. Because, a lot of us live in this original sin construct. But if you flip back just a tiny bit, there's an original blessing there. It was good. It was good. It was good. It was really good. And so I think if we honor what came first, I think that's part of the homesickness we all feel. Everybody has it. I've been a therapist for over 20 years. Everybody has that vague homesick feeling in them. And I think it's hard to miss something you've never known. And it's not surprising to me that the very first story that we see, the story of the fall after creation, the first kind of human story that we have there, leads to self-consciousness and shame. That's kind of the highlight of where there's this major downgrade in the sense of, I can't get back to, the garden is kind of the original home. So I can't get back to it. It's like, it's a permanent downgrade and I'm stuck in it, and they go from consciousness to self-consciousness, and we kind of stay there once we get there as individuals as well, but also developmentally, toddlers, the very first task that we, after primary infant attachment, the first task we run into is either learning this sense of autonomy or this sense of shame and doubt. So developmentally at the toddler stage, like at the potty level stage, when we realize we're separate beings from everyone else and they can see that, and sometimes we're bad and sometimes we don't make it to the potty in time or whatever, shame starts then. We tend to trace our shame back to middle school because there's also another kind of a fall there for all of us. But that original one happens pre-memory for us. So it's a core wound for a lot of us. So I think part of what I'm talking about is, Carl Jung talked about the me parts, what he called the me parts and the not me parts. And the not me parts are these ideas in my head that got there through socialization. And they're disruptive and they're fragmenting, and they keep me from getting back to who I was before I was told who to be. And I think that's why Jesus, really advocated for a childlike faith. I don't think he meant necessarily a childish faith, but a childlike faith, a child, where we're in touch. And I guess an easier way to say this was being in touch with our child of God identities and walking in that. I think it's like being a resident of a kingdom or a beloved community in real time, if that helps.
No, really good. Any questions? I know Mary Howard had a few notes, just a few.
Yeah, well, I was just writing down some things. I'm going back a little ways to when we were talking about fears, and you mentioned that Missy said that, it's this fear of karma. And then a little bit later, you mentioned there's this fear of losing our privilege. And does that mean, because some of us as white people of privilege don't even believe or recognize that we have that privilege. And so is that fear just something that's subconscious that manifests itself? I mean, if we don't, you see what I'm asking? If we don't recognize I have this privilege, how can I be afraid of losing it? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So I think on the primitive level, we're sort of hunter-gatherers, and hunter-gatherers need to hoard and sort of store up for winter and that sort of thing, so I think, and even, agricultural societies had to do that as well. So I think, the fear of lack is at the core of every human's consciousness in some way. But in our situation, we're in the context of a capitalist experiment, and that has really worked really well for some and not really so well for others. And I'm not trying to compare or contrast to that's better or worse than any other society on the planet, just to say that is the context we're in. And it does lead to individualism and sort of self-preservation, and it activates and amplifies those core fears. And you know, we're the, if not the most charitable place on earth. So it's not as simple or cut and dry as one or the other, but I think two things can be true simultaneously, that we do give when we feel compelled to, in ways that feel not scary, you know. So I think that's why there's so many charitable people who really don't like the welfare system, because there's this fear of like this endless bleeding out of resources, that sort of thing. So wherever giving feels scary, I think is where we tend to clam up around that. But, you know, privilege is a weird thing, because that word tends to sit with people in whatever way they originally conceived of that word. So then you're constantly fighting the original definition of whatever the definition was in that person's mind. You say privilege is relative. So I was the only white kid my age in the neighborhood I grew up in. You know, and so I was kind of unaware of all these things. But as I got older and watched how, you know, as we moved into the larger world, my peers and I, and as we all went from Verona to Tupelo in high school, how life was different, you know. And it wasn't easy for me either, because I was, you know, kind of the poor white kid or whatever, you know. So, I mean, it wasn't an easy transition for any of us. But when I saw how, you know, a lot of things unfolded for me and connected for me just because of my skin color. And so I'm not ashamed of that, and I'm not guilty about that or anything, but I do acknowledge that it's real, and it's been my experience. I'm not as afraid when I get pulled over as I would be if I were black, you know. So privilege is relative. You know, I had a black teacher in 7th grade who at the lunch table instructed me how to hold my fork correctly, because I had the monkey grip on it. You know, I didn't know any better. And she said to me, you know, I want you to really listen to me, and I want you to learn this and get this right from here on out, because if you don't do this, then the world won't know that you're smart. And if they don't know it, you'll forget it. And she lifted me up, and that she used her privilege. And this is a black woman who was disempowered, to lift me up. And so all these years later, when I'm grown, I go to visit her, and she tells me about all the racism and sexism and being denied promotions and all these things she was going through at the time. And she lifted me up higher than society was willing to let her go. You know, she used her privilege to lift me up even higher than the other people who look like me were willing to let her go. And so privilege is about power. Wherever you have power or opportunity, if you will, just the opportunity to lift someone up who to just be launching pads for one another, you know, to take turns launching one another. So, you know, I don't feel obligated, but I do feel indebted in a way where I'm just compelled to be a launching pad for other people, because, you know, I can love in the way that I was first loved. You know, simple as that.
So, anybody else? You have like 100 notes over there, Mary.
I know a lot of them revolve around fear, though, and afraid. One thing I did, this was kind of at the beginning, when you were talking about white supremacy, just how we think of that today as, you know, that really, really horrible, hateful, evil group of people that is that really small percentage.
Right.
And what we think of that, today's terms. But I think, hoping maybe you would talk a little bit, just briefly, about what white supremacy, though, I mean, what that started out to be. You know, in general, it was just this idea that, oh, well, white people are superior.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, it takes it has to be one or two things in my mind: evil or a defense mechanism that could say, okay, here's a group of people that I consider to be primitive in some way, since they don't own a lot of weapons or have the combined force to overcome being subjugated or whatever. They're at the end of the day, Native Americans and enslaved Africans were guilty of being vulnerable. So there's something in the collective that sees vulnerability as there's a place to have a feeding frenzy. There's opportunity. It's a predatory way of thinking, right? And we have to wrestle with the fact that it has played out in a particular way along the lines of skin color. And yes, there have been genocides in other countries where the warring parties had the same skin tone and all. I get that. There's colorism in the Black community. I get it. But there's also the sense that human history's played out in a particular way. And, the people in South America speak Spanish for a reason, right? The South has the largest concentration of people of African descent for a reason. So all these things have played out in a particular way where the particular perpetrators in this particular scenario were European, were white, and we have to wrestle with that. Defensiveness around, oh gosh, I'm white, therefore I need to find a way to defend myself, just isn't helpful. Society has been set up in a way that has benefited some more than others. And I've heard every argument around that. The most common one, well, if Black people are poor, they can get free college, and just all that stuff. Those are just defense mechanisms. How about let's just address the fact that systemic problems really do exist, whether I want to believe it or not, and not wanting to believe something and denying it doesn't make it not true. So, I guess biblically there, I would say that, fear and love are opposites. Hate's not really the opposite of love. Hate is a perverted love. It's passionate, but indifference and fear, those are the opposite of love. And I would also add to that objectification of other people. And if you can find a way to blame people for their plight, and I see this happen to white people as well, they're just ignorant. We just placed a label and a huge assumption on someone. Most people that are, quote, ignorant that I know really have a huge amount of mental capacity, not inferior in some way. And so you see where, I think one of the things that breaks my heart the most about this is where you see where there's resistance and pushback, there's going to be an equal, there's going to be a response or a reactivity that's equal in its kind of spirit or the feel of it. There was the organizer for Black Lives Matter, I think in Canada, who said, "For the white race is inferior." And so everybody gets up in arms around that. Well, man, I've been hearing white people say that stuff all my life, and nobody seemed to get as upset. But that's the karma of it that I'm talking about, where every action has sort of an equal reaction at some point. And if this had been addressed long ago, and if we had done a better job of addressing it, it wouldn't be such a heavy transition into a new normal. It would have been, if we had done this out of cooperation and goodwill instead of force, every change that's ever happened in Mississippi's been because of outside force. It took the SEC and the NCAA to get the state flag down. It took federal mandates in 1974 to fully enforce, Brown versus the Board of Education almost 20 years later. There's a whole lot of resistance, and that is rooted in fear, at least fear, probably a mixture of other things, but definitely fear at its core.
So a lot of people commented on or reacted to your distinction between childlike religion, childlike Christianity versus childish,
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could put that in context of these discussions about race, because I'm thinking childlike religion, you wear a mask, I'm sorry, I completely lost track of what I was trying to say. Just put it in the context of race.
Yeah. So, I mean, it takes me back to, that book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Just the basics, just back to basics. People really love to romanticize, videos or pictures of like a white kid and a black kid hugging each other, because there's just something so pure and beautiful about that. And what we're seeing is an image of what we lost. What we're seeing is an image of what the world of man's image took from us. Now when there's a discomfort and there's a lack of relationship and a lack of proximity to people who are different from one another, we grieve that. Whether we know it or not, we want that on some level. A lot of us do. We long for repair. And so I think that's a childlike faith, and that trust. Children are vulnerable because they trust. Again, that first developmental stage that goes wrong for infants who don't have someone to attach to is, trust versus mistrust is the core, very first thing we learn as infants, and so a lot of us learn we can't trust. And some of us trust the wrong people. And unfortunately, a parent who teaches you racism, you trust them, but you really can't trust them at the same time, to guide you in the way that would lead to life for self and other. So, there's so many ways to draw the distinction there. But another thing I would say is, a childish faith would stick with the fact that we have cartoons in our minds as kids when we hear the story of Noah and all that, and we stick with that, and we become very, very literal and very, very sort of fixated on literal interpretations, which is the lowest level of truth. There's so much to learn from all of these images and stories that we miss if we only read through one filter. And then, we have this belief system we have to define and defend for our sense of belonging. That's where the fragmentation and separation happens. If we can't even hold the church together without splitting into thousands of denominations, how can we even address racism? I think it was James Madison who, in a room full of white guys at the founding of the country, said, diversity is the mother of all division. And he was talking about a room full of white guys who pretty much had a similar vision, just down to the details, So, a lot of this, it's why I call it, I think spiritual warfare and psychological warfare, a lot of times there's a lot of overlap there, or maybe it's even the same thing, because we're not dealing with just flesh and blood per se, but we're dealing with, powers. To me, powers and principalities include thoughts and emotions, and not just these invisible ghosts flying around us or something. It's like a lot of that's going on in our consciousness, that a lot of what we call spiritual warfare is a battle for our consciousness and our mind and our hearts and our souls, and not just some whatever the Hollywood version or the cartoon version of that is that we come up with when we're 5 in Sunday school. So
perfect. That actually takes us to about an hour.
All right.
Go ahead and let you go. How can people find you on social media, or if they're in Nashville or something like that?
Yeah. So my website is TonyCaldwell.com, but you can find me on Facebook, Instagram. I'm at Tony Caldwell, Twitter, Tony_Caldwell_. You can find my writings at redletterchristians.org. The podcast is called Voices of Wisdom, and it's pretty much everywhere you can find podcasts.
And just following you on Facebook, I don't do Twitter or Instagram very much, but just following Tony on Facebook, you will have access to some of his writing. I appreciate things that you post that aren't necessarily an article or something that you have. Just some of the random things you write are awesome.
Yeah, thank you. So that there's a lot of Tony Caldwells on Facebook, but I'm Tony Caldwell 501. I think if you put that